My mom kicked me out at 19 to make room for the baby she had with my stepfather. Years later she begged for help, but I made her pay the price. I, a 25-year-old female, was kicked out of my house 6 years ago when my mother, a 45-year-old female, and my stepdad, a 49-year-old male, had my half-sister. My mother had me when she was very young. Her grandparents and parents were very old school and strict, so they forced her to have me. She hadn't even wanted to tell them she was pregnant, but unfortunately, my dad didn't know this and told them before she could say anything. From what I've heard, she took a pregnancy test, and as soon as she saw the results were positive, he called both their parents and told them everything because he thought it was news she'd want to share with them. He didn't even wait to ask her, which was pretty stupid of him, but then again, that's just how my dad is. Needless to say, they broke up shortly after that. Since they were never married, it was a much easier process. My parents had met each other in college and had been together for a year when they got pregnant. After this little stunt my dad pulled, my mom dumped him, but she couldn't get rid of me because her family already knew, and they said that if she terminated the pregnancy, they would disown her. So, she had to go through with it. I know the story because she has told it to me several times and keeps reminding me how lucky I am to even be alive today because, had it been in her hands, she never would have had me. It's always such a nice thing to hear from your mother. She claims I am the result of my dad's stupidity, which makes her even more annoyed with me than she usually would be. That's why I was raised to make myself as invisible as possible. My grandparents and great-grandparents made sure I was born, but they didn't account for what would happen to me after that. My childhood was rough, to say the least. You already know how my mother was, but my dad was no better. My mom hates me because she didn't want me and wouldn't have had me had it not been for family pressure. She also believes I was the reason she couldn't go further in her career because she had to take care of me alongside college and work, which is fair, I guess. But resenting me just because I was born and treating me badly as a child seems a little excessive. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't deprived of anything as a child because my grandparents were the ones paying for everything since my dad couldn't afford to pay child support. So, I had everything I wanted, but I still got the feeling I was nothing more than a burden to my mother, and she never did anything to make me feel otherwise. She never spoke to me kindly or showed me any affection. Even when I achieved something, she never celebrated it with me. It was like living with a very cranky older roommate who hated you for no reason and just wanted you to go away. On the other hand, there was my father. He was much sweeter and nicer to be around compared to my mother, but he was just as incompetent as a father. I'm pretty sure that when I was a kid, he definitely had some drug problems. I couldn't recognize it back then, but now I'm sure he was a pothead. He would always be doing weird things and saying weird stuff to me, but I dismissed it as him trying to be funny for the most part and didn't think much of it. He would attend all the holidays and my birthdays and would have dinner with us once a month, but my mother seemed to hate him as well. I could always hear them fighting about his behavior. My mother didn't want me, but she was stuck with me because her family had decided my dad wasn't capable enough to take care of me, and honestly, they were not wrong. They had to decide who would raise me for the most part before I was born, and my mother's family made sure she took the responsibility. My dad only got to see me on weekends, but even that was implemented only after I was a certain age. Before I was 10 years old, I lived with my mother full-time and only saw my dad a couple of times a month. After that, I was allowed to live with him on weekends. It was a downgrade because, after I turned 10, I realized my dad was definitely not ready to be my father. He lived in a tiny apartment, and it was very apparent he could not afford to live the kind of lifestyle my mother was used to because he lived in poverty. The living room had a distinct weed smell. I also knew he was unable to hold down a job for long since my mother would complain about it all the time. She kept telling me that if my dad wasn't a complete idiot, she would have been able to pawn me off to him for at least half the week instead of just the weekend without her family hounding her about it. At my father's place, I felt welcomed, but I didn't feel comfortable because I knew having me over was putting a strain on him since I obviously couldn't live off one meal a day as he did. Nevertheless, he still made an effort to cheer me up whenever I was at his place. So, that's how my life was as a kid. I had to put up with my mother and her constant reminders that I was not wanted at our house whenever I was living with her, and on weekends, I had to deal with my dad in the state he was in. When I was around 15, my mother started dating my stepdad, Jeffrey. He was not a bad guy, but he was not a good guy either. He was simply indifferent to me, and if I'm being honest, that was much better than my mother and my dad. He didn't talk to me, I didn't talk to him, and it was all peaceful. They were together for a few years, and then when I was 17, they got married. 2 years later, they announced they were pregnant. I wasn't really concerned about it because it had nothing to do with me. I was still going on with my life and sticking to my routine as usual, but I had no idea what was about to come. When I was 18, I decided to take a gap year instead of going to college to get some work experience for later. I regret that decision. I should have just gone to college when I had the chance because my grandparents were ready to pay for it. A few months after my 18th birthday, my mother and her parents got into a very bad fight because of some stupid little thing I don't even remember, and they stopped speaking to each other. This also meant they stopped sending money for me, and I was on my own. Thankfully, I was working as an intern at the time, so I was getting some money. On my 19th birthday, I started applying to colleges, and my mother was 7 months pregnant at the time. Even then, she didn't tell me anything about what was going to happen when my half-sister was born. However, just a week after my half-sister was born and my mother had come home from the hospital, she and Jeffrey sat me down and told me they had something important to tell me. I was taken aback because I couldn't imagine anything my mother had to say to me that could lead to anything good. When they started talking, they told me they needed the room in the house because, now that my half-sister was born, they were going to hire a full-time nanny, and they needed to give her a room to stay in. There was the master bedroom, which my mother and Jeffrey used, my room, and a guest room. My mother told me they were going to repaint the guest room and make it into a nursery. Of course, they couldn't let anybody into their own bedroom, so it was about time I left the house because I was already 19, and as an adult, I had no reason to be living with my parents still because it was getting weird, and they needed their privacy. I thought it was quite shocking because, even though I was legally an adult, I still needed a home because I was going to have to come back from college eventually, and then I would need a place to go. I told my mother about it, and she said that whenever I needed to come back, I could just go live with my dad. But that was not possible because, at the time, my dad had turned into a serious addict. Not only did he have a drug problem, which was bad enough even if it was just weed, but he had also developed a gambling addiction, and his home was not the kind of place anybody would want to go to. I obviously couldn't go live with my grandparents because they were not on speaking terms with my mother, and if they didn't want to speak to her, there was no chance they would want to speak to me because, to them, I was just an extension of my mom. This is also why I had never had to worry about money before because, since my grandparents wanted to take care of my mother, they also took care of me. But once their relationship was over, so was ours. I knew this because I had tried to get back in touch with them several times but with no luck. It was bad enough that I was getting kicked out, but I also had to start thinking about how I was going to pay my way through college because, while I was applying, I had assumed my mother would do it for me. I knew she hated me, but I thought going to college would mean I would be away from her and the family, and she would want it that way. But when she told me she was kicking me out of the house, I asked her if she would be willing to pay for me to go to college. She just laughed in my face and said that not only was she kicking me out, but she was also cutting off any ties she had with me because she had done her time, and now that she was not even in touch with her parents anymore, she had no reason to keep me with her. I was shocked that anyone could be capable of being so cruel, and I ended up crying. She just made a face and told me that if I was going to cry, she would rather have me do it outside the house because I was ruining the vibe of what was supposed to be an otherwise happy day. Before that day, I had never said anything to my mother because I didn't want to argue with her or waste my own time. But that day, I decided to stand up for myself because I was not going to get kicked out of the house silently. I would go kicking and screaming, but I would let her know exactly what I thought of her. I told her she was a terrible mother and had always been one, and I was actually glad I was getting rid of her finally, and my life would be much better off without her. To that, she just turned around and told me she didn't care about any of it and just wanted me to leave because, now that she and her husband had a real daughter, she didn't need me anymore, and I was just as unwanted as I was before, if not more so. I broke down once again, and I think it was pretty much the worst day of my life. But I still collected myself a little while later, packed my things, and left the house, never to look back again. Once I left, I headed straight to my dad's place. I knew that no matter what state he was in, I was going to correct it and make the best of my situation because I was not going to let both my parents and their lackadaisical attitude ruin my life. Once I got there, I realized my dad was in pretty bad shape, and his house was even worse. I couldn't even tell the last time it had been cleaned thoroughly from the looks of it. There was trash all over the floor, and he probably hadn't showered in a really long time. By then, I knew he hadn't had a job for almost a year. He was losing money left and right because he had a gambling addiction. He was lucky that his dad had passed away a couple of months ago and had left him a bunch of money, which he was now squandering. As soon as I reached my dad's, he tried to tell me he was happy to see me, but he was too high to actually say anything. He just smiled at me and thought that would be enough, but I was not in the mood. I had already been having a very bad day, and I just couldn't deal with it anymore. He had a joint he was smoking, so I walked up to him and smacked it out of his hands because I was going to make sure he stood up as a parent and did everything for me that he hadn't been doing for as long as I was alive. I was not going to let his bad habits ruin my life. So, I told him I was here to stay for good because my mother had kicked me out, and now he had to make up for everything he hadn't done for me and really clean up his act. He thought I was kidding and tried to pick his joint up off the floor, but that's when I lost my temper and ended up slapping my dad right across the face. I regret it. I shouldn't have done that, but I was losing my mind about my future, and I just lost sight of what was important in that moment. So, I ended up doing that, but it didn't lead to anything bad, so I guess it was meant to happen. When I slapped him, I immediately started apologizing, but he was really mad, so he went back into his room and shut the door. There was only one room to begin with, so I decided to stay in the living room. The next morning, my dad was the one who came to me and asked me what exactly had happened the previous night. He had sobered up by then, so I told him everything in great detail. I told him I needed his help and wanted him to clean up his act because I wanted a better future for myself, and for that, I would need his help and cooperation. He couldn't just gamble and stay high all day like he was used to. He was a little shocked that my mother had kicked me out and called her up to ask about it, but she didn't respond. That was the day it was decided I would live with him. Since he had no money, he could not afford to send me to college, but he promised me he would try his best to be a better father to me because that slap had really brought him back to his senses in a major way. It wasn't easy, and it was an uphill climb from that point onward. My dad relapsed into his old habits several times over the next couple of years, but I still stuck by him, and he promised me he would try to keep getting better. I couldn't go to college, but I couldn't waste my time at home either, so I decided to apply to a few companies for internships. I got picked for a few of them. They paid well, but not enough to sustain a nice lifestyle or to pay for college because, if I did apply to college, I would have to quit my internship, and then I would have no money. I wasn't ready to take out a student loan because, at the time, I wasn't sure if my dad would be able to do better in life, and I didn't want to dig a hole for myself that I couldn't get out of. So, I stuck to working, and whenever I was not working, I was doing household chores because the house had to be clean, and I couldn't allow my dad to live the way he had been living for so long. I wasn't the only one looking for jobs. My dad was also doing the same, but since he hadn't been working for a really long time and had a bit of a reputation because of his previous employers who didn't like him because he was always high on the job, he found it much more difficult than me. It was a lot more frustrating for him as well because his daughter was bringing home money, but he wasn't, and that was bound to get on his nerves. However, neither of us had anywhere to go, so in spite of everything, we had to stick with each other and deal with everything together. Then, finally, around 3 years ago, something great happened to us. My dad was working as a store manager, but it barely paid, and the hours were long. I was working as an accountant. It paid slightly better, but it was a very tedious desk job. However, one of my friends who lived in a different state told me her father was expanding his business and opening a new location in my city. This friend of mine, Aggie, had known me since we were in middle school together. Her parents got divorced, and she moved to a different state with her father, but she comes back for the holidays every year to meet her mom, and that's when we get together usually. She knew everything about me and what kind of trouble I had been through in the past few years. She had even offered to help me out with college tuition, but I couldn't take money from her because then I would know I owed her money, and I couldn't live with that. I had refused to take money from her and her father, even though they were happy to help me and were quite rich since her dad had a large-scale office supplies business. They made the decision to branch out recently, and she contacted me to let me know she had a job offer for me because she knew I was looking for something. I was a little scared that she was doing this as a favor to me, and I asked her about it. She said her dad wouldn't have usually considered someone my age for a position like this, but she had talked him into it because she knew I could do it, and I just had the drive and ambition. She trusted me and knew I was capable enough to handle it. It was technically a favor, but she reassured me she also had faith in me, which is why she was doing me this favor. So, she asked me to become the corporate liaison for them, and I was happy to accept that position. It came with much better pay, and I would have to work longer hours, but I was glad to do it. I also asked her if she would have an opening for my dad, and given his qualifications and past work experience, they decided to make him the warehouse manager because he had experience in that field and had worked in that position before. So, we were sorted, and that was the first time something good happened to us. Since then, things have only gone well, and my dad and I are doing much better now. He is off weed completely and doesn't gamble anymore either. We have moved into a much better house in a nicer neighborhood and have been living here for the past 2 years. Things are going super well, and I couldn't ask for more, really. 6 years ago, I wouldn't even have imagined myself in this place, but yet here I am. As for my mother, I didn't have any contact with her after I left the house and had no idea what she had been up to all these years. But 2 weeks ago, she contacted me and told me she needed my help. She sounded pretty desperate, and I could tell something serious had happened, so I decided to hear her out. Apparently, my mother had quit her job shortly after I left, and she and Jeffrey had started a business of their own. Unfortunately, it had been flopping for a really long time, and I don't know why, but they kept investing in it and putting money into a place where they knew they were not getting any returns. Surprisingly, they ended up going broke, and now they had a bunch of debt. They were selling everything to repay everybody they had taken money from, but they were still falling short. My mother had heard from a relative that my dad and I had moved into a better house, so she assumed we were doing well now. She thought it would be a good idea to call me up and ask for help. She didn't even apologize. She just said we should put everything in the past and keep our differences aside because this was not just about her. She also had a little daughter whose future was at stake. If I had any kindness in my heart at all, then I would help them out and pay off some of their debts. I thought it was very gutsy of her to ask me for help after what she had put me through. Just to mess with her, I decided to agree with her on the phone call and play along, but truth be told, I had no intention of actually giving her any money or paying off any of her debts. I still told her I was going to look into it and help her out just because I was feeling petty. So, for a few days, I led her on and talked to her every day while she told me about her finances and stuff. I heard her out, knowing I was not going to contribute in any way whatsoever, and this was just for fun. But she didn't know it, and I kept waiting for her to apologize or something, but that apology never came either, and that made me feel a lot less guilty about what I was about to do. Then, 2 days ago, she finally asked me when I was going to send the money to her. So, I told her the truth. I was not going to send any money to her, and she had been played. I reminded her of what she had put me through all those years ago, and not just that, but the way she had behaved with me throughout my childhood. She was a fool to expect I was going to help her out after everything that happened, and she hadn't even apologized to me. She had no reason to expect anything from me. She was an awful human being and a terrible mother, and I was going to make sure everybody knew about it. So, I hung up before she could say anything, and I made a post about all of it. I narrated my entire story and even included the part where my mother had come to me 2 weeks ago, begging me for help and acting as if she was entitled to my money and contribution. It was just ridiculous and stupid of her, and I wanted everybody to know about it, which is why I did it. I personally don't see anything wrong with it, but my dad thinks I took it way too far and that I shouldn't have done it. I don't know what my mother's reaction to it was because, after that phone call, I pretty much blocked her everywhere. But I know my relatives can still see the post, and everybody who knew my mother now knows what she has been up to and how she treated me in my childhood. I think it was necessary for me to expose my mother because she had always pretended she was a really sweet person and a successful, career-driven woman, but that was a lie. I think I did the right thing, but my dad thinks I shouldn't have said anything to her and just ignored her the first time she approached me for help instead of playing along and stuff because that's just cruel. I'll admit it was cruel, and that was the intention behind it. She had been cruel to me all my life. I think this was fair game. I'm not in a movie. I don't need to do everything right and set an example for other people. I can just do what I want. But anyway, my dad thinks I took it too far and has been insisting I apologize. So, Ida for promising my estranged, toxic mother I would help her pay off her debts but then backing out at the last minute and exposing her online? So I took the advice most of you had for me and decided to sit my dad down and talk to him about it, and it actually worked, which was nice. He hadn't really been an active father for most of my childhood or any of it, to be honest. He was always just high and didn't seem to care about anything, so obviously, he didn't remember most things. But then I reminded him how awfully my mother used to treat me and how I basically had nobody because, even though he liked having me around, he was not exactly there for me. That managed to make him realize that what I did was coming from a place of anger and resentment, and I had been bottling it up for ages now. So, what I did was not the right thing to do, and it was definitely not the moral or ethical thing to do, but if it gave my frustration and anger of all those years an outlet, it was probably good for me. So, he understood and stopped saying I needed to apologize to my mother. She never apologized to me for anything she put me through, and on top of that, she had the audacity to expect me to help her out. It was entitlement on another level altogether. She hasn't contacted me after that, and it's been almost a week. I know everybody's talking about it because I received a lot of messages asking about my mom, but I'm really not interested in talking to other people about it. I posted whatever I had to say. I have nothing more to add, and now I have a lot of work to do as well, so I don't have time for this drama. What's done is done, and it's over now. So, my mom finally reached out to me today after almost 2 weeks of being no contact. She didn't have much to say. She just told me she never should have trusted me and that she regretted ever having a child like me. But it's fine, the feeling is mutual. I also regret having a mother like her, and I would rather have been an orphan than have spent my childhood with her. She told me that, thanks to my little post, she couldn't live in this town anymore and had decided to move away because the shame and embarrassment were just way too much. So, I finally got what I wanted, according to her. But honestly, I don't really care where she is. She and I haven't been in touch for a really long time, and it makes no difference to me where she lives. So, that's something she's very wrong about. But it's okay, she's a narcissist, and she has a tendency to make everything about herself, so this is no big surprise. Anyway, I'm just glad she's moving away and that I don't have to talk to her again because she's blocked me. So it's been a month since my mother moved away, and things have been quiet. We don't have any contact anymore, but I heard from a few of my relatives that she has apparently cut her entire family off and is not speaking to anybody. Good for her, I guess. My dad and I are still doing great, and in fact, my dad just got a raise, so it's all good, and I can't complain.